Costa Vavayakis balances exquisite technique with expressive improvisation. Viewing this workshop will be like watching a master magician raising the curtain on how a particularly masterful trick is accomplished. But Vavayakis does more than mere tricks. This session is nothing less than an intimate and illuminative view on the creation of high art. Vavayakis currently teaches at the Art Students League of New York, the National Academy School of Fine Arts, the Chautauqua School of Art, and Brooklyn College. He has been the recipient of many distinguished awards, including the Pollock Krasner Foundation Grant and the Gregory Millard Fellowship from the New York Foundation for the Arts. Mr. Vavayakis has most recently shown at Leslie Heller Gallery, New York, and his work has also appeared in exhibitions at the National Portrait Gallery, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., the Museum of the City of New York, and the Frye Art Museum in Seattle. His work is held in numerous public and private collections throughout the United States. Join us for this extraordinary opportunity to explore drawing the human form with Costa Vavayakis.
Hello, I'm happy to show you how I approach a 3-hour portrait drawing. I have Rainbow here to pose for me, and I'm going to do a 3-hour drawing, portrait drawing, on a toned piece of paper that's roughly 12 by 16. It's a Fabriano Tiziano paper, has some texture in it, and like I said, it's got a tone. So I'm going to work with graphite and white chalk. Graphite coming from the dark, white coming from the other end. And so the paper acts as a bridge tone. And I set up my easel to be pretty much on a side of my subject so that actually from subject to edge of the paper there's enough space but not too much space. So I use peripheral vision so that I don't move my head back and forth. So we're set up, lined up accordingly. Here I line it also to my eyesight halfway the paper so that there's no distortion of the simulated picture plane. So a lot of times my students, beginners, set up very low because we're used to writing and not drawing, and that distorts the simulated picture plane. So what we want to do is set it up halfway in the middle, eye level, and halfway horizontally in the middle. Vertically halfway, horizontally. And then we're ready to start. I also have to set up, make sure that where I'm stationed is pretty much level. So I use a level at times, and/or I use also a plumb line. A plumb line could be made by any kind of weight, heavy weight, and I use a thread, a cord that is either red or some prominent color so it's visible. And I line it up against the edge of the paper to see if it's straight. If it lines up pretty much right on, we're ready to go. I'm going to use, as I said, graphite. And when I start, the range of graphite, I'm going to use mechanical pencils today. And the advantage to those are that you really don't have to sharpen them. There are two kinds of grades that I use, a 0.5 and a 0.9. A 0.5 is thinner, 0.9 is a little thicker. They also come in 0.3 and 0.7s. 0.3s I find too small, they snap, and 0.7 is in between the 5 and 9. So I kind of like to use the 5 for thinner lines, 0.9s for a little thicker lines. I'll start with a 0.5 HB, and I'll move to harder pencils as I go along. And in a shorter duration on a drawing, you really don't need as hard pencils. The harder pencils are better for halftones, building up halftones. On toned paper, as we said, it's a bridge tone, so you don't need harder pencils as much. When I work in white paper, I use all the way up to 9/8 because I build up to my half tones, up to the highlights, I should say. So we'll start, and Rainbow, you're ready to go? A lot of times I start without using my glasses because it works as a squint. When we squint, it adjusts. We see the value hierarchy well, so it's easy. The details are not so prominent because we're always working from the big picture, the gestalt. So first things we want to do, of course, is assess the composition. We want to see how we want it to look on the page. I'm basically going to do a bust, a profile, but it's very important how it sits on a page. This casts a shadow, so I'll move it up for now. And so basically what we need to do, we talk about assessing the overall shape, hitting the apexes of the shape, of the positive shape, basically the head, neck, shoulder girdle, and see how it sits on the page. And we do it by basically carrying our lines really long, meaning we don't look in short distances. And I use a variety of line. I'm holding the pencil on the side because I don't want it to drag. Also, when you hold it on the side, you quicken the pace. Basically, we're guesstimating well. And then once we do these guesstimates, then we sharpen our vision. I move these clamps as far over so they don't really affect composition negatively. So we use preliminary lines, and the lines are hitting the apexes, as I said, and they're hitting the apexes of the shape and form. So basically what I'm going to do is split the skull into threes here, from crown to orbit, from orbit to base of the nose, bottom of the nose, and then from the bottom of the nose to the chin. That's the general 3-3-3. But I'll use also the facial angle hitting off this apex, and that apex. So I'm still settling in, deciding on the composition, and hitting off all the edges. And I want to see how comfortably it sits. I'm always also using, when we say the lines that we use these envelope lines, which is enveloping the shape. We use these transverse lines, which are hitting the apexes of the form, meaning the mass. We're not going to small distances as long as possible, right? And because we're always going to be using these long measurements as we shorten our gaze, our measurements, we're always relating them to the long, the small to the big. So now, after that, we want to, and once we feel comfortable, I feel comfortable with the composition, which I'm setting off. I want to make sure there's enough space on the right side so our gaze sits along that, doesn't move too quickly. We want the focus. I want the focus to be on the front end of the profile, not the back. So I give a little bit more space on the right side to the left. And I want to make sure that vertically it sits nicely. There's enough of a base. I could always cut the paper down, but I want to make sure there's comfortable space on top and a little more on the bottom. So I'm still feeling for where I'm going to start. I actually am going to work from top to bottom. So I want to make sure that the top space is enough, but not too much. So I think I'm ready to kind of go into the next stage of the drawing. Now, I don't I make a lot of lines because a line is a place of where you come to and then where you depart from. So you really don't want to erase lines too soon. The beginner erases things, obliterate things. The more advanced you get, you realize that the lines are starting points, right? So you need to have enough there, and then you erase accordingly after you make the adjustments. Now, as far as erasers, I start off, the all-purpose eraser is the kneaded eraser, and that is great because it's really the most flexible one. And I could use that eraser almost throughout this whole drawing and just that. But the other erasers are the polymers. These are the plastic ones that come in different colors and sizes. I usually cut them smaller so that I can get into areas. So you can always get it that you come in squares and then you can just cut them accordingly. The other erasers are the ones in the barrels, and one manufacturer makes, this is called Tough Stuff, and they designed a very thin barreled one, and it's a very effective one because, again, you can get into a smaller area and it doesn't bend too much. And then for me later on, and maybe I won't do it in this drawing, I use the typewriter erasers, which are more for tougher drawing and also for blending, like a smudge stick. But for my purposes now, basically I'm going to make now adjustments on my drawing and erase afterwards. And I make a decision. Once I feel comfortable in the drawing, I'll have a starting point. And I'll drop this down for sturdiness now. And I figured I'm really comfortable with the crown starting here. So this is where everything, I'll work from top to bottom. And I also want to check the side. Yeah. So I can go in a little bit more. So I'll start with the crown over here. And when I move now, I'm going to check, again, the facial angles we talked about, hitting the apexes from crown, tip of the nose to the chin. And next step, I'll start at the crown, from the crown to the orbit here. And again, now what we're going to do is also actually set the shadow shapes in place. And when I do the shadow shapes, I fill them in because when they're filled in, schematically, just as a tone, fully, it's easier. It then becomes a very solid proportional tool. If they're not filled in, it's harder to use it as a tool. Because basically that's what we're doing. We're using our line systems, shading systems, as tools. So you see in a way right now, and as I go now below, we talk about eye level, now I lift this up. I don't lock that. I keep that unlocked so that I can move up and down, because now I'm in the lower part of my drawing and I want to see it without distortion. Now, I'm areas that don't have a lot of light. In a case where, Rainbow, I'm going to ask you to, if you don't mind, take your hair and move it behind your ear. Yeah, so I'm going to make a decision now on whether to have the ear exposed fully. I was finding that it was just too little light in that area. So I am now going to align the ear to the front of the profile. I'm still right now, at this point, I'm still making decisions on whether I need to push it over a little bit, because I'm looking at it now and I'm thinking maybe I could use a little more space on the right. But in order to do it, I have to constantly use these preliminary lines, not get too locked in. I think I can go a little bit over. So what I'm going to do now is not erase, use what we have, because that's the key. Because these lines that we have are now points, if I didn't have them here, I wouldn't know where to go. So right now I'm just moving like 1/4 of an inch in more. Because again, for what I want to make sure there's enough room on the right side. Composition is really the gestalt, is what we start with and what we end with. So now I've reestablished a reference point. We said we're working from top to bottom, right? And now I'm making sure I'm working from right to left, right? So now I just moved it in so we have enough space. Now a lot of times what happens usually in our drawing, it shrinks a little bit because as our focus gets sharpened, because that's what's happening is these shapes get sharpened, the shapes shrink a little bit. So knowing that and knowing your tendencies, I'm kind of pretty much feel safe with my drawing. When we line up the ear to the face, we use horizontal plumbs. And whenever we do that, we talked about the vertical plumb, and we can use a string with the weight, we said, right? But you can't use it this way. Well, I guess you can if you hold it to the end. But I use, you could use a long stemmed pencil. And what you do is we said you always want to lock your arm out. I'm now taken to the helix, the top of the ear, and lining it up according to the eye socket. So then I'm using a horizontal plumb line, and you see right now what we did is we used the plumb line for corrections, for adjustments, for checks. Right? So now we're using the top and bottom, lining up the bottom, the lobe, to the base of the nose here. So now we brought it down. Now, how do we align it horizontally? That becomes more, we'll use units. Using units from the eyebrow. And again, we always say with the eyebrow, we want to make sure that we use eyebrows not as landmark indicators. We want to make sure that the front, in this case we're looking at a profile, now actually seeing a little bit of rainbow's right side. And this is actually a good point to make this perspective. We're always lining up lateral landmarks from one side to the other and drawing lines across. In this case, I've just adjusted it to I used eyelash to eyelash. In this case, we talk about eyebrows are terrible landmark indicators when they're lined up, when you're trying to see the front plane, because it's the eyebrow sits below on the brow on the inside and wraps above on the outside, so it gives the optical illusion that the far eye is further up, and it's always deceptive. What we do want to use eyebrows as landmark indicators when front meets side at this point. It's an important landmark because you see the front plane to the temporalis side plane. So I'm going to use that break and then start hopping along distances across here and here. So we have sections here, and then we're lining the ear now horizontally. So we have the vertical alignment, the horizontal alignment, and when we're doing anything, we use transverse lines, right? In this case, we talked about hitting the apexes, so I'm just hitting it, not rounding, using angular marks, because the arc is very difficult to assess. We always want to use the angle, the long end of the arc. In this case, so we're comfortable with both sides. I want to make sure that, we're lining up pretty much close to center. Now I think we're ready to go to the next stage of our drawing. And now I'm going to decide to use another reference point, and it's the eye. The eye, the ball and the orb. You notice in this case I'm making an angle across. The eyeball sits on an angle because the orbit protrudes out here further, and this more inward. So the eyeball tilts in. So in this case, you have close to a 45-degree angle from the top of the eye to the bottom of the eye. Now, the parts of the eye that are lit up, usually with a top light. Now, the light, by the way, one thing we didn't discuss earlier, is a top light, top frontal on rainbow. So The portion of the eye, which is the ball and an orb that's lit up, is we have different sections. We have the ball in the orb, and then you have the lids that envelop the ball and the orb. So you have the orbital portion of the upper eyelid and the ocular portion of the upper eyelid, and then the same below. You have the ocular portion and the orbital portion of the lower eyelid. In this case, when we look carefully, we realize that the sections that are lit up, the only sections that are lit up are the top planes, which are the orbital portion of the upper eyelid, the ocular portion of the upper eyelid, and the thickness portion of the lower eyelid. And everything else is pretty much in shadow. So as a shape, I'm going to start from the front, and basically all this will be in shadow. Now from here down, the spaces in between the features are very important. So from the end here to the start here, I measure down to place the ear and eye in place so you don't have a floating eye or too long of a nose. So the spaces in between the features are key. And then I fill in accordingly. Now, at this stage, I'm continuing down on the shapes of the lips. And again, I'm constantly using my preliminary lines from upper lip to lower lip. I'm dragging a transverse line to measure. In the case of rainbow, there's a little protrusion on the lower lip. Make sure we line it up. So we're always using our preliminary line systems all throughout our drawing. That's the key. We never stop using what we use in the beginning. Now also the tone of the hair is lower value than the skin. So what I do schematically, I'll set it in, and using a hatching, instead we're going to use a hatching technique, I'll fill it in accordingly. So any tone, local value that's lower, including the robe, will be a lower value. So now you have an overview, of a schematic overview of a light and dark. Boom. Now at this point, because the tone of the paper, we say, it's like a mid-range, lower half tone. What I'm going to do is start introducing my white chalks. Now why I do this early on is to set up, to realize the relating tones, but also actually as a measuring for now, again, a proportional measurement. So basically when we are establishing right here above is a down plane, the start of a down plane, a crest shadow, where the light ends and the shadow begins. The plane break towards the light is where the highlight is. So when we look at, we'll hit the whites, we'll use the white on the dominant plane breaks towards the light. Now as far as chalks that I use, there's a variety of chalks. I find that the chalks that I like to use are the ones that are softest, because then you get a range, meaning that you have a real, from light to dark, you have like at least a 5. At this point, I'll probably use a 5 to 7 variable as far as tonal range, from the lightest light to the less. There's always like a comfortably, at least 5-digit change. Now it's predicated on sharpness of the cylinder, the barrel. I'll use 2 ways to sharpen. I always have a plug-in sharpener, and/or the other way to sharpen is with a blade. And in both cases, you want to make sure that you have a good, a quarter to half an inch nose on it, so that you can hold it on the side, and you can have a sharp point so that you can get subtle gradations. Like I said, at least 5 gradations. And as far as the companies that I use, as far as the pencils, I like the Generals, white charcoal. I also use the Pitt. It's called Pitt Pastel. I'll use the Cretacolor number 1 or 2. Number 1 is a little softer than 2. It's also the white pastel. I'll also, depending on how I work in definitely different ways, but I'll use sometimes a lot of different whites, and I'll use, let's turn off. I'll use a variety of different squared whites, Conti, 2B to HB, and also new pastels for softer. And I think we'll take a break now. Put my glasses on I think because I'm settled in comfortably with the overall, we said, the overall composition. And we talked about when I draw like this to begin with. But then because we want to cover ground as well, because when you hold your stylus on the side here, you have this range to cover your format. Now, when we're working in areas, maybe we want more stability, so we put our palms down and cover a smaller area. At this point, a lot of times what I do is just put a piece of paper up on the right side here, and I'll swing it over so you don't get any kind of smudging. And I also use papers. I cut up papers. You can use papers like this thinner for making little unit measurements as well. It's like your ruler. So I cut small pieces like that, and I keep them around to use as tools, marking tools. So now I said I'm going to work from the socket. That's where I'm going to concentrate. That's my reference point. And again, when we say eye, we want to make sure we work from the socket. And then the eyeball. And then the socket on the middle is the nasal bone. And again, I'm using the long gaze, making sure that it's a short distance to the long always. And I use a hatching technique. Before the cross-hatching is always a hatching. And the hatching is really good. Usually when we do a comfortable hatch is a 45 degree. It's a natural hatching system. So for right-handers, which I am, I come up from the top right to the bottom left at 45 degrees. A left-hander would come the other way. The famous left-handing draftsperson is Leonardo. He came from the other end. Michelangelo, Raphael, they came from the right-hander's edge. And in the shadow, I flatten my shadows, because when you compare the shadow shapes to the light shapes, it always appear flatter than the lights. So I'll use a hatching more system in the shadows, and then more of a cross-hatching system towards the lights, or in the lights, I should say. So I keep refining the drawn, the shapes, again, always measuring short to long. I use the white. Now with the white, actually, when you fill in the white, I use the same kind of system coming in from the dark. I'll hit the darkest dark of the form, which is the crest shadow. The light ends and the shadow begins. So the dominant plane break away from the light. That's what I'm hitting right now at the turn of the base of the nose here, at the bottom of the nose. Distance in between are really important. And then you erase after you make adjustments. I make sure to leave a lot of lines in until I'm really very comfortable with the relationships. Now, a lot of times there's points where I start thinking of smudging, and it's always an interesting thing because really a smudge, as far as analogous to, I always use it, the analogy to how it appears when we paint. The smudge, when you smudge, it acts as a glaze, like as if you were glazing in painting, oil painting. And then when you mark with your, when you go back, let's say, to a hatching, it's as if you were scumbling. Now, in it, when you smudge a lot of times on toned paper, it can get a little too dark. So I use now my kneaded eraser to lighten up the smudge area, but continue that veil-like feel. So now the eraser acts as a value neutralizer as well as erasing areas. Even in areas you could erase and also use it as a value neutralizer. Now in this case, whenever I'm working in the lights, I'm thinking around the form. In this case, I'm working around the form in the lights. In the shadows, I'm thinking of constantly flattening, so I tend to 45 degree a lot, hatching in the darks. And always assessing the outer dimensions of the shapes from start to finish. Here on the outer end of the orbit is the crest shadow, which is the darkest of the form. Then you have the crease, which is the ocular portion of the upper eyelid. And then you have the cast shadow that sits below this outer plica. Also, there's a light that hits, of course, on the eyelashes. And the eyelashes on the upper portion of the eye are thicker than the lower eyelid, the eyelashes. Also, it's the upper eyelid is the one that really moves. And we said we see the other portion of the rainbow's left eyelash, and I'm going to include it. It's interesting because it's a perspective element. It tells the viewer that the artist is sitting just eye level, just slightly below rainbow's eye level. It's interesting because I'm slouching a little bit. I always go back to rapid strokes to pull it together. And again, adjusting my eye level. The lower I'm looking at my format, the higher I bring up my easel. And every time we continue our drawing, as we continue, we're using those preliminary lines. Again, I'm always checking the horizontal and vertical, the ear to the front, because it shrinks, so now we're going to pull it in a little bit. Our drawing usually shrinks a little bit when our siding, because right now I'm seeing rainbow about this size. I'm doubling the size. I'm seeing her. The way to put it the actual size is putting on the same plane, which is what some people do when they do site sizing, life-size site sizing, and then moving back. So in order to do that, I mean, we want to always make sure that, because we're doubling it, sometimes you do it even more, we always have to use our check systems because it's easy to go awry. I try not to develop the halftones unless they're really low. These are lower halftones than here. I'd let the paper do its bridging job. So I'm always going to go back to the plane breaks and keep refining them. And trying to stretch out my white as much as possible, the white, so that we're coming on that end. And sometimes if I want something to be lighter, what I do a lot of times, say it's erase the area a little bit so it doesn't smudge with the dark, with your graphite, and I'll seek a softer white to see if I could get it to be a little lighter. Because the paper really basically you pick a paper, a tone paper, based on its value first. It's actually the three elements of color, or hue, is the value, the temperature, and the brilliance. So you really choose a paper accordingly. This would be a mid-range, actually mid to lower range value, a cooler on a scale, fairly cool, bluish cool, and pretty high on the intensity meter. I want to make sure as I'm hitting the contour with the white, I'm always making sure that that is not the strongest light. If I'm adding it in, I've got to pull out the true highlights, which are considerably lighter. Can't let certain optical contrast throw off the actual true contrast. As we said, it's the plane breaks towards the light that are the highest values. Towards the ones that are the front planes meeting the side planes. So the front plane of the nose meeting the side plane, and then also the lights hitting onto the ravines, which is the plane break from the side meeting the front, both ends. As I said before, that actually the gradation of the graphite becomes, or I'd say the one advantage to graphite for me, why I've used it over the years, is that you can really develop the higher end of the spectrum, meaning the lighter range, which is much harder to control, to express with the darker medium like charcoal. But on tone paper, it becomes more of a moot point, because, like I said, the paper acts as a bridge tone. So I'm pretty much working from HB, F to H. In this case, a 2H. And again, I'll just grab it because I know that it's a 2H based on its color, so I don't have to think. The reason I tell people to do that, students to do that, because you don't want to be thinking too much. You want to be reading, reacting when you're drawing, so that you're activating the instinctive, intuitive, improvisational side of your brain. Now everything comes down to here, so everything has to shrink a little bit. And we know this when we're starting, so we're anticipating our drawing. In this case, maybe there's a little more of a backside that I probably wanted, but again, it's not too far off the idea. I put this on the side here so that it swings out, because I'm always wanting to see my drawing fully. At this point, though, I want to make sure it doesn't smudge, so I'll just slide it over. I'm using plums to line up forms from one side to the other. And whenever we do that, we have to establish a reference point. In this case, it's the forms to the right. The forms to the left, alignment to the forms to the right. So I'm taking the bottom of Rainbow's bun there and lining it up to the eye. I'm even pulling it further down. And you see how many lines I'm constantly putting in and then adding and subtracting. Pentamenti. I'm actually, you notice I'm working towards the contours and then from the contours. So the edges are always constantly reassessed. So you don't want to like make your summation at the beginning. You're constantly reviewing, revising. So you're refining. So I choose paper too that gives me that flexibility. And this paper, as I mentioned, has a great erasing property. It doesn't ghost out when you erase, so you don't get to the pulp of the paper. It's sized very well. Its purpose is for pastel, actually. So it has an internal and external sizing. So it takes a lot of pounding, because I'm using, as I said, these styluses that are firm. I'm not using quite, even though I'm working it softly at times, I'm actually aggressively, and especially over time, pressing on the paper with a fairly hard stylus. Now my tendency is always to get in, really to get in very into form and into smaller areas. But in order to do that, you have to always constantly assess the mass. Otherwise, it'll look like, I always say, like, in order, my paintings are very hyper-realistic, but they're based on working very with solid protocol from the plane break away from the light. So all the time I'm constantly going back to the crest shadow, making sure that's dark enough. before I come up into the halftones, or the other way around from the lights down. That's what I'm doing on the nose now. I want to actually show the front. I want to add more white on the front, so I want to see how much I can pull out the white, the highlight. As long as it's in ratio. Yeah. So I'm actually, in this case, deciding I'm using a lot more white because the tone of the paper is actually closer to a lower level halftone on rainbow. If the paper was a higher value, I would use less white. And a lower value, use more white. I'm still going to lasso the ear a bit. And always assessing things, always assessing the distance, vertical distance, top to bottom by using horizontal plumbs to line them up to the face. So I use all my more preliminary tools. This would be a later tool, the typewriter eraser. But I have right now all my erasers from beginning to end, and all my tools from harder to softer, graphite on my left. So I'm constantly going back and forth, making adjustments, relating adjustments continuously, and deciding that I'm actually going to use a little bit of, see, that's the thing, it's like I didn't know that I would be doing this quite using this smudging as much, and but I'm finding that that's working for the effect right now. So that's what we always work. I work really open-ended, I should say. So even though my drawings is always a little bit slightly a different approach based on the problem. Whenever I want to reassess a beginning line, I'll take the preliminary tool, the HB, which was what I started with, because that's the darker line, the easier, more softer instrument. And I go back to it when I'm reassessing the big shapes, or when I want to kind of go into the darks and cover an area more. That's what I'm doing here. Now when things get a little bit cluttered in the area, then we need to erase an area and get back into it. In the case of the ear. Sometimes when I'm starting a drawing, when I'm doing sketching, I'll use these short-stemmed instruments. I cut them in half. A lot of times I'll take a full long barrel and cut it in half. And what it does is it helps me cover areas quicker. And that's what I'm thinking I'm going to go for again with the hair. And then go back and pluck out a little bit. Again, for the fact that we can get more for time economy reasons. That's why actually it's really good to have a full range, no matter how specific your motifs are. It's good to have a full range of mediums, of understanding of different media, and experience with them too. Take my time to assess my subject, even kind of finagle the easel too, if we want to. Even maybe there are times, maybe what I'll do is even get a little closer. Rainbow, I'm going to ask you to move this back just a bit. That's good. And it's going to move in. You know, the closer you move into your subject, the larger the image, the siding image appears. So as I said before, that in a way I was doing rainbow twice the size here, from back here. In this case, I'm doing, it appears maybe a third larger. And as we move up right on the same plane, then it's the same size, the actual plane. So got a little closer. It changes a perspective, and at this point, the perspective is not the issue. Overall, I think I'm pretty set with it. I do this a lot when I'm working, particularly doing my paintings over time. I'll start further away so the receding lines, the orthogonals, don't get too extreme, kind of steady. They're a little more steady the further away you go, you are from your subject. And then when I'm settled on the perspective, I get in close to work out the tactile, you know, the form, translucency of the skin, the details that I'm into pulling out. So in a way, at this point, we're going to work another 2 more sessions, 20 more sessions, including this one, so one after this, and I'm going to settle it for the next time. I'll probably work on this another 3-hour session to complete it. And what I'll do is I use this for studies for potential paintings. So it'll have like a certain completion, an ends in itself, but it'll also be for, let's say, research for future painting projects. everybody has their temperament as artists. Some people, and even though I do work differently, as I said, and I know I have to work from a very solid protocol in order to make something look to realistic and to a certain degree naturalistic as well. And it's the discipline of working from small to big, always relying on the big, the long gaze we talk about, short to long. But my temperament is I am a modeler and love to get into form. So, and it's something I've had to really for years train myself to rein that part in. And we say our strength is our weakness. So right now, I'm like at the sweet spot of the drawing where I just want to go in and model. So it's almost like this really, I don't know, like a real fun part for me. But again, it's the thing is that what you have to do is always step back, knowing that always the rein is a very important tool for the artist, is knowing how to rein oneself in. Whenever I come out into the halftones in turn, I always go onto the crest shadow, make sure there is a certain degree of turn so it doesn't feel patchy. And like I said, in this case, I did do a little bit of about face and started working a little more tonally than initially I started to. But I think it's important to say this, because the more you work on a cross-hatching technique, the more it becomes more of a tonal drawing, obviously. The more you're layering, the more you're cross-hatching, hatching and cross-hatching. And depending on even how, of course, more softer your instrument, the quicker it moves into that. That's what Leonardo showed us in his groundbreaking head studies of the Last Supper. That influenced Michelangelo and everybody at that time. He used a left-hander's hatching and, to a certain degree, cross-hatching technique, because he really cross-hatched very minimally. And he used the earth chalks and red and black, and they went into a tonal sphere the longer he worked on them. And they went into a tonal sphere very quickly because they were pretty soft. So in this case, I can go even now. The more I work on a drawing, the more I'll introduce harder pencils. So you can go over on it. So I'll see how hard I can go. And in these mechanical pencils, usually the hardest that they make are 6H, 5 to 6H. This is a 6H. But it's really, hard to find, actually, in the stores. They usually, because a lot of people who use them don't go any harder than 2H. But see, in a way, you can introduce the great thing with graphite, and one of the reasons I use it, is that you can create form very subtly going on a higher end of the spectrum. So in this case now, the effect this has is like a scumble textural effect, is a scumble over a glaze. Its tonal effect is to create a very subtle, gradual drop in value and modulation too. And you see, I'm always going on to the turning plane. So if you want to create any developing here, as you develop your drawing or painting, you always go back to the major plane break. This is a crest shadow. I'm making maybe at this point an emphasis to kind of stay on a little bit more of one area, which is more the front right here, and work out towards it, since I made a decision to work on this another time. So I am actually going to concentrate on the face portion a little bit longer. Now I'm also thinking maybe I want to start darkening the halftones. So before I add any tone on with my graphite, I'm going to see how much, I'm going to erase a little bit from the lights to see if I don't have to put any tone, let the paper bridge it, maybe lower it. And I'm thinking I might not need any tones in here, but I actually need to clear the area up so it doesn't gray out. Again, there's different ways of working. If you work more in a pastel, you're blending. In this case, I'm trying not to blend. I'm trying to overlay and let the paper blend in, turn the form. So in that case, I have to be really careful not to have it too much grayed out by having the chalk interfere with the graphite interfere with the chalk. But you see, in a case where you're using your harder pencils, I'm staying with this. I'm actually, if I tried to do this with an HB, it would get too dark. And that's the great advantage of charcoal. It's using charcoal to its, let's see, I'm kind of bridging it, always going back, still going back to the darks. Basically, what happens with these graphite is that you have the binders are wax clay. Percentage-wise, more clay, the harder, and more wax, the softer. So that's what makes it also reflect, is the clay. But you can go clay over a little bit darker, as long as it's not like so extreme. If I use 6B, so to speak, here, it would have so much clay, so much wax, that the clay would slide over it, like it would skate over it, and it would not blend in. But as long as you keep the gradations close together, as far as your graphite, then you don't have the skippage, the incongruent, the mixed media feel. I always talk about having an internal clock. Even though we want to get lost in our work, of course, we need to have a little of an internal clock to know. When we do a 5-minute, 2-minute drawing, 5-minute drawing, 10-minute drawing, we want to have a state of completion within that time. So we completed a drawing in 3 hours, a profile of rainbow. We talked about the construction lines that we use all throughout our drawings in order to contain the proportions. We said an envelope line for the composition to establish the positive and negative shape. We used transverse lines, hitting the facial angles. We use smaller transverse lines from segments, from point to point, from apex to apex. We establish shadow shapes, and we fill them in so that they become proportional tools. So basically, it could be a 5-piece jigsaw puzzle as opposed to a 100-piece jigsaw puzzle. I was making decisions, aesthetic decisions, based on what I wanted to say, emphasize certain parts, worked from reference point. That's a very important thing to establish a reference point and work off that. And we used graphite on white paper, using the tone of the paper to bridge the halftones, to use as a bridge for the halftones. And we also, what I did in the drawing is also changed up a bit from a hatching to a bit of a tonal technique, but it's not either or, it's hybrids, we said. It's always a combination of the two. So and this drawing is a drawing that I'm going to use for future ideas, but I'm going to ask Rainbow to sit one more time to tighten it up, to use it for a possible portrait, a profile portrait that I want to do of Rainbow. So it was totally my pleasure. Thank you.
For more information on Vavayakis's work, visit www.costavavayakis.com.